Welcome to the Notable Mentions versus OpenAI episode of Using AI, the podcast where we discuss how individuals and organizations are actually using AI and how they think about this space. I'm your host, Alex Denne, and I'm joined by esteemed scholar and senior ML research scientist, Alex Papadopoulos-Kofiatis. Welcome back to another Alex and Alex episode. Alex?
Alex, maybe we should get another Alex to join Ginny so that we can have a triple Alex episode in the future.
I think that would be too much, wouldn't it? I have to ask though, when it comes to referring to you as an esteemed scholar, the
Yeah, I
words
was
came to me, but I'm
wondering,
not sure.
what is
Are
a
you
scholar, Alex?
are you a scholar? Can I find you on Google Scholar?
You can find me on Google Scholar. If that's the criteria, then yes, I am a scholar. I
All
have a
right.
PhD and I've researched in the past, but I don't know what the formal criteria to be considered a scholar are.
Interestingly, it comes from a university student holding a scholarship, but a more archaic definition, according to Google, is a person who is highly educated or has an aptitude for study.
But probably I'm a scholar then.
Yeah, and you're
I
certainly a
also have had
specialist. That's another
scholarships.
definition, a specialist in a branch of study. So you're definitely an ML scholar.
Are you a scholar, Alex?
I don't think so. Maybe one day. Maybe one day. Not a scholar in the typical sense. I tend to think of myself as a resourceful generalist. I have some scholarly tendencies towards growth, I suppose, and marketing and product. But
You're a scholar of life.
oh, there's the phrase. Love it. All right. Well, what are we going to be scholarly about today? I've so far just said notable mentions, but really, we've been going through a series of comparing big names in the AI space to OpenAI. We have not mentioned a few that we should. One of those is Cohere. Another one is Mistral, Perplexity, and I mean, it's a little bit unfair to put them in the same bucket as these other three because they're worth $1.5 trillion. But NVIDIA do also have their own model, which is called Nemo, which we can talk about as well. So let's start with Cohere. Any initial thoughts on those, or shall I give them an intro?
Go ahead.
So I think Cohere are a really interesting one in this group. They're based in Toronto. They actually just opened a second headquarters in San Francisco because, AI. Their founder and CEO, Aidan Gomez, was actually one of the 8 authors of the research paper, Attention is All You Need, which we've referenced before, credited with changing the AI industry and helping lead to the creation of ChatGPT as it uses the paper's proposed transformer architecture. Any corrections on that bit, by the way? I don't want to get any of that wrong.
No, everything's correct. And yeah, that is a famous paper, and everyone involved in that paper has some kind of status, including Aidan.
Cohere are reportedly in the middle of raising a $1 billion round. We'll put a link to that story, which has come out over the last few days in the show notes. Interestingly, people think that will be dwarfed because OpenAI are trying to raise much, much more money at the same time. And we'll get onto the bitter lesson and what that means later. Cohere specialize in chatbots, so nothing really new there. And search functionality, which is a little bit interesting. But they specialize in those areas as chatbots and search functionality for companies, for enterprise, rather than for individual consumers. So that's quite a unique take. We've seen OpenAI beefing up their enterprise efforts over the last 6 to 12 months, perhaps, but Cohere claim that they've been doing that all along. They claim, therefore, that they are the leading generative AI tool for enterprise use. And they do have a couple of big sticker logos. They are embedded into several Oracle products and have been embedded into several Salesforce products. So fairly big names. And the idea is here that companies can use their own data to train their Cohere AI models without sharing that data. And that last bit, that's the key bit for enterprises. For instance, Oracle, which now owns major healthcare cloud provider Cerner, has used its own data to train Cohere for medical and first responder professionals. So that would be on sensitive data that company has access to. but you wouldn't want being shared with the wider training data set of the model. So a very interesting one, and it's been around for a while, 2019, I think. And I'd be interested to know if you've heard much about it or what your thoughts are on Cohere.
So I've definitely heard of Cohere. They're one of the big names alongside OpenAI and Anthropic for providing APIs with language models. They're very interesting because of the business focus. I haven't had an opportunity to try out their models, but at the same time, I don't really see their models in comparison. So I just wonder how they would be compared to open source models like the Llama 2 models that we discussed last time. Because those models as well, you can have the same fine tuning on private data aspect, right? And I wonder whether Cohere's models are better than that. I would hope so.
You would definitely hope so. So you haven't seen benchmarking of Cohere?
I'm sure that it exists, but no, I haven't. I did attend one of their launch events last year in London, where they had a fireside chat with Aidan and their chief scientist. And I was quite impressed with how they described their organization and the internal teams that they have to train those language models. I think they have a pretty big team. They're taking it seriously. So I'm excited to try out their models and see how they perform.
It must be a bit harder, you would think, to benchmark a tool where its entire purpose is to be fine-tuned and specialized.
But they also have generalist models, so you can just sign up and use their models without fine-tuning, right? So that would be the performance that would be benchmarked.
It also looks like, although they claim that they don't do anything for individual consumers like a ChatGPT product, they do have a button on their homepage that says chat with our model, and you can just sign up and you can play around. They've got a playground. They have a knowledge assistant, which allows you to do sort of retrieval augmented generation, which do you mind explaining a little bit about RAG? Because I hear that term, that acronym come up quite a bit with regards to AI.
Yeah, it's a pretty
we have our own
popular
internal
technique.
use for it, so I always get a little bit confused.
So the general idea is this, that sometimes you have a long document that doesn't actually fit in a language model. So if you want to retrieve information from that document or many documents or the web or whatever, and feed them to the language model in order to generate a reply, you cannot just put everything into the prompt. So what you tend to do in those cases is do a retrieval augmented generation. So that has two steps. First, you do the retrieval. So based on the user query, you go and retrieve the sections of the document or pages in the web or whatever that are most relevant to that query. And then with that subset of text, you go to the language model, you give it the query, you give it the relevant information, and you ask it to provide a reply to the user query. So that's this combination of the retrieval aspect, find similar relevant information, and generation aspect. So take that relevant information, give it to the language model, and have it generate a reply for you.
Is that something that pretty much all models with an API allow for?
You can build a RAG pipeline using a model with an API, but for example, ChatGPT by default does not use that, right? You have to build a pipeline that does this. If you've used tools on ChatGPT that allow you to upload a document, for example, and ask questions of it, like any of the ask my PDF document a question GPT plugins, then they probably use retrieval augmented generation to do that. And also now OpenAI offers something similar with their assistants. So you can have an assistant where you upload your documents and then you ask questions, and then that does use retrieval augmented generation. But it's not something that's built into the base models.
So overall, with what we know about Cohere, just before we move on to the next one, Mistral, any thoughts or feelings towards them other than the fact that you've been impressed by what you've heard? And I guess we should be impressed with the partnerships they have with Oracle and Salesforce, and that they are running, I guess it's not on-prem, but it's like the equivalent. It's like private cloud or private model in the healthcare space. And we know that healthcare AI is ripe for disruption.
In general, I'd keep an eye on them because they're a big player. They have enough funding and good enough team to build good models. And I think there's space in the market for more than one or two or three players, right? So I think that the models are possibly already good enough, and they might come up with better models in the future. And who knows, maybe also challenge one of the bigger players.
And if anyone listening has had a play with Cohere and knows of any benchmarking papers, please do send them our way so we can take a look and cover them more deeply next time. Moving on, one that I know you love.
I do, yeah, Mistral. So it's a French company. So a bit of European competition. And they are focusing on open models. So interestingly enough, we had a discussion in the last episode about this, about whether Meta's Llama 2 model is really open source, or because they haven't published the code to train it, but only the weight. Interestingly enough, Mistral actually describes the models as open weight, so they do use that terminology, and I like that term. I think that maybe Meta should also adopt this term, since it more closely resembles what is actually happening, right? So they're open sourcing the weights of the model, or the model itself, rather than the code used to train it. So you can download the models and use them. They are right now very trendy in the open source community because they've come up with a mixture of experts model called Mixtral, play on the name there. And it's a very good one. So it's smaller than Llama 270 billions, but it outperforms it consistently and performs on the level of GPT 3.5, apparently, which is very good for an open source model. So interestingly enough, a mixture of models is supposedly what OpenAI also uses for GPT-4, right? So there's something there, and it allows for a big model to run like a smaller model.
A little point here I'm curious about, and very excited that the EU does have a company like this in the race. I know there are others as well, but the more the merrier, I would say. The 8 times 7 billion model in comparison to the 70 billion Llama 2 model on benchmarks is saying 8 times 7 billion basically saying 56 billion.
A great question, and it actually is not, because you don't it's 8 experts, each expert models, each of those has 7 billion parameters, right? But you don't use them all at the same time. So what happens is that for every token you generate, for every word you generate, let's say, there's only 2 experts at any time that are involved, and there's a bit of architecture in the front selecting those experts. So for every token generation, you select 2 out of the 8, and then you generate using those 2. So it's essentially equivalent to around a 13 billion model or 14 billion model, rather than 8 times 7, right? So it has the same speed as this, same memory requirements. So it's much quicker.
Very interesting. They can still use a large token window for this as well. You can still, I know context and tokens, context windows, like the amount that you can put into a prompt before the model says, that's too much, I can't handle that. That's sort of gone up and gone up and gone up. And 32K is actually heaps, right? I know people have competed on it, but it's a little bit like, how people competed on the size of, say, an SD card. And it doesn't really matter that you can now get a micro SD card that is 512 gigabytes that fits in your camera, because that's going to take you 3 years of photography to get anywhere near filling.
I think for longer documents does matter a bit, but just to put it into context, it is GPT-4's initial context size was 8,000, right? So 32,000 is very good compared to that. Doesn't reach Anthropic's 100,000 or the new GPT-4 Turbo models context sizes. And in practice, it might matter a bit for very long documents, but it is a very respectable context size, let's say, especially for an open source model.
And are you able to discuss any more about the possible ways that they have these sort of 8 experts, right? You use those words, those would sound like they're people. They're obviously not people. This is what, like, the way I'm imagining this is you can sometimes tweak I think they're called the hyperparameters of a GPT-4, for example. You can ask it to be more creative, less creative through the temperature hyperparameter. You can ask it to repeat itself less, and other hyperparameters that I'm sure are more useful. The 8 experts, could it be as simple as different weights of those hyperparameters? And when the prompt gets thrown in, is there something on the front end? You said the front end that just says, oh, for this, we want something that's not creative, and we want something that doesn't repeat itself. So that is one expert. And then those 2 experts run through it, and then what it combines that, it synthesizes and says, okay, there were some interesting bits that were creative because one of the experts was actually half creative, but not fully creative, right? You don't want a fully creative thing to try and solve a maths problem. You want something that's quite cut and dry. So how do you imagine that works? And are there any other words other than the word expert that might be easier to visualize?
Essentially, each of the experts, let's say, is a bit of a separate model. They do exist in the same model architecture, including the thing that I mentioned at the front. So it's not at the front end, it's still part of the model. But let's say that there's someone initially, a mini expert that selects where to route the requests, right? That's still all part of the same model, but you can think of each of the experts as a sub-model within that model. They have different weights, they're trained on different data, so they can handle different scenarios. One aspect might be what you mentioned. I don't know if it actually is, so creativity, for example, but I would imagine that they're also trained on diverse data. So one expert might be trained on more legal data, or the other might be trained on more medical data, so have a sub-expertise on that domain. That said, I'm guessing. I'm not actually sure how the model has been trained, and I don't think that they say either. They say that it's been trained on data crawled from the open web, but that's the case for all models, I guess, currently. Maybe
Yeah,
not all.
that's standard. Also, it's funny that they say that, and yet they say that they are open and transparent. Not that open and not that transparent, but they are. We do love the fact that they have transparent access to weights, which means that it is more customizable than many models. So that is great to see. Is Mistral? Are any of those models available on Hugging Face? I'll just go have a quick search now, but I've
They are,
wonder.
yeah, they are.
Yeah.
And the community has taken a lot of those models and made them even easier to run by doing a process called quantization, where you take a model and essentially lower its fidelity, or like it's a bit like lowering the resolution on an image, I guess. You still get the same image, but a bit fuzzier. But then you can run it much quicker on your local computer, for example. So there's a lot of community work to enable this with the Mistral models. It's also interesting that they offer these models as an API, a managed service, right? So I assume that's the business plan. That's how they make the money as well. So if you don't want to go through the hassle of hosting that model yourself or running it locally, you can go to Mistral and just like pay them for API usage, just like OpenAI.
Also similar to part of the Hugging Face business model we were discussing. There obviously seems to be a demand there that these companies are
Correct.
discovering that people are happy for pay as you go rather than investing in their own architectures to run these things.
It's very interesting how both Hugging Face and Mistral are French companies. So the open source competitors are both European, and not just that, but both French companies as well. It seems to be something in France, maybe in the water.
Something in the water in France. There we go. We've become a conspiracy podcast. Moving on. Perplexity. Perplexity is a very interesting one. Do we want to say anything about Mistral other than that there's something in the water? Just to round that off, do we want to
I think
say
that's a
another one
good
to
way
keep an
to.
eye on?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. Especially for open source, right now they're topping the leaderboards. The model is very efficient. It uses a mixture of experts. It's very cool. So definitely one to try out.
Okay, so then moving on to Perplexity. Perplexity, this is going to sound so stupid. Perplexity seems to me to be the more perplexing of these. I guess when I first thought about the name, it's quite a nice name. It's like we're going to solve the perplexity of information, right? It's one word. It's easy to remember. But now I understand it more. I think it's actually quite confusing, but they might be onto a business model here, which is quite different to all of the others. So I think they're very interesting. Perplexity say that they use multiple large language models, including Google Gemini, Mistral 7 billion, which we just spoke about with the experts, Anthropic's Claude 2.1, and OpenAI's GPT-4. It also says it uses its in-house model, which I believe is called experimental. Perplexity Pro subscribers pay very similarly to ChatGPT subscribers $20 a month. And with that, they can switch between the different models and access various features. So they're trying to be a little bit like a one-stop shop. You can pay them $20 a month rather than OpenAI, and you can use GPT-4 through Perplexity. Investors include Jeff Bezos, which to my mind is not at all surprising, given that Perplexity seems to have a very similar umbrella platform approach to AI. So Amazon has used that sort of one-stop shop platform for e-commerce, and they've used it for Prime Video. This actually really ticks me up about Prime, because we are Prime subscribers in this house. But so often I'll go on IMDb, I'll be looking at movies or TV, and I'll want to use them, and I'll see it's available on Prime, and I'll find that what I have to do is pay on Prime for another TV channel subscription. And they're trying to be an aggregator. So Perplexity, invested in by Jeff Bezos, is also trying to be an aggregator of AI models, which I think is quite interesting. They have actually openly said as well that they don't know how to monetize search, which is the market they're going after. They're going after search more than chat long term. And their goal seems to be focused on scale and product improvements. That's, to be honest, very similar to all of the others that we've discussed over the past few weeks. And the others discussed in this episode so far. They tend to be doing scale and product improvements rather than just solely focusing on revenue or other aims. And the aim for Perplexity is to produce fewer hallucinations. And hallucinations, just as a reminder, is when an AI model's response appears confident, but is ultimately false. And it could be a false citation, it could be a URL that doesn't work. There have been some great examples from the legal industry where people have cited cases that ChatGPT has just made up. I believe that's now happened on 3 separate occasions. You'd think everybody would have learned from the first time that happened. Apparently not. Humans can be slow learners. Total funding for them is now over $100 million, which is not as much as the others on this list, but they have just recently brought in $73 million this side of the new year. Anyone can try Perplexity. It's such a nice URL. It's just perplexity.ai. And I was using this earlier today. This is a podcast about using AI, so I think it makes sense to use these when we can and report back. Every time I use it, I love it because it tells me exactly where the response is coming from. So I know this is really minor. And when, I know a lot of our listeners will be thinking about enterprise and professional use cases. For me, currently, while we're recording, I have a tikka masala slow cooking. And I wasn't sure. I didn't want to buy a tikka masala paste. I wanted to make my own. I'm trying to do that more with the spices that I have. So I said to Perplexity, look, this is the situation. This is what's in my slow cooker right now. I'd now like to turn this into a tikka masala. And it gave me a response very helpful, just as ChatGPT would, but it also gave me the sources of which recipe websites it had taken that from and then amalgamated it for me. I could have Googled the same thing, but I would have got a worse experience. So it's definitely an improvement over Google search, which is the market they're going after. But it also feels a little bit like it's just a skin or a layer over Google search. It just feels like there's a tool that knows Google search, and then it just goes, okay, I'm going to take the top 10 results, maybe even the top 5 results for any one search, which you can get in an instant. And then I'm just going to put some sort of Gen AI flavor to that and show the sites that I've used as citations. So it makes it look really clever. It makes it look like it's solving the hallucination problem. But is it a little bit of fake it till you make it? That's my feeling with Perplexity. I wonder what you think.
I mean, I think it's very interesting. While you were talking right now, I was playing around with it a bit because I hadn't before. And you're right, it does provide like pretty good results with links to the examples that it pulled its data from. It is similar to what we were discussing earlier, the retrieval augmented generation. It's a bit different because it doesn't retrieve information from a single document or a series of documents, but from the whole internet. But it works like that in practice. One thing to say is that ChatGPT also has something like that. That was the browser plugin for ChatGPT, right? Where you ask it a question, and then if it is not confident that it has enough information in its trained weights to provide the answer, goes and browses the internet and provides responses from the internet, including links to where it pulled the information from. So in that sense, Perplexity is not very different from that. But it feels to me like they've packaged it a lot better into a product and into something that can be actually quite useful. So you did say they have their own language model, but to me, this is not a language model provider necessarily. It's a service thin or thick wrapper on top of OpenAI and other language models provided. And I think it can actually be very, very useful. Now that I tried it a bit, I'm planning to try it more and use it more and see how it responds.
Interestingly, each time I've used it for a period of time, I've ended up going back to ChatGPT, and I can't put my finger on why. I think it's because Perplexity sits in the gap between GPT-4 and Google search. And maybe I haven't figured out when the best time for me to use something in the middle is, rather than me using one and then trying the other if one didn't give me the response I needed. But if you'd never used ChatGPT and you'd never used Google search and you used Perplexity, I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I see it more as a competitor to Google search for myself. So maybe instead of Google searching things, I will from now on try Perplexity first. I also really like that they have after their results, after they answer, they have a related section where it shows you other queries that might be relevant. And for the queries that I tried what is an authentic recipe for a Mai Tai? It actually gave me related queries that are very good, very on topic and quite relevant. And the Mai Tai recipe it gave me was the authentic one. I was testing it out there, but it passed.
Yeah, very interesting. There's a lot to like about it. Another thing that I haven't mentioned, which feels a bit more like Gemini in its response, is the images it provides. A lot of these tools are very text heavy, and I know it didn't add any value to me while I was searching for the right spices to turn my base into a tikka masala curry. But just seeing the image of a curry made me feel like I was in the right place. And as a marketeer, I understand what's happening there, right? There's like a little bit of psychological stuff going on where I'm saying I'm in the right place, right? That is a curry. I'm looking for how to make a curry. Whereas otherwise you have to decipher the text to then understand, am I looking at a good response? So there's something comforting about the images, and it doesn't take up too much real estate. I also think they have strong apps and they're free to use for a certain amount. So a really fun one for anyone who wants to consider an alternative to GPT-4 and their $20 a month subscription. I would really suggest you sign up to Perplexity. Maybe let us know how you get on.
One other feature that I see now that I really like is that they have a focus button where you click and then you can select what kind of sources the answer is going to pull from. So they have all search across the entire internet, but they also have more specific things like Wolfram Alpha for computational knowledge or academic published papers, YouTube, Reddit. So you can constrain where the answer generation comes from, which is a pretty cool feature. And it also means that they have separate indexing and separate searching for each of those, which sounds like a good idea.
I really like that in the same context as the Mistral discussion with the experts, because you might have an intuitive feeling that is Stack Overflow is the right place to go for this, or Wolfram Alpha is going to be the right place to go for this. I don't want the answer muddied by the nonsense that you find on the wider web, right? There's a lot noisier. So it does feel like you can almost choose your source and choose your expert with Perplexity. And I think that is a nice model going forwards and a nice experience. There is also one other fun thing about Perplexity. Some of our listeners may have heard about this device called the Rabbit R1, which was shown recently at the Consumer Electronics Show this year. And it's a $200 AI hardware device. It looks a little bit like a square. It has a little screen. It's got like a tiny little roller button, and it's got a microphone. And you can effectively ask it to do anything like you would a phone assistant, but it's not a phone. It's just a way of interacting with. And they don't bill you monthly. It's a $200 one-off charge, and you get this device, and you can just carry it around with you and chat with AI models. And what it does is it does, using Perplexity, I believe, it sort of queries the different models, or will use the model that is best for the prompt that you've given it. You can type as well if you don't want to just use your voice or you want to make a correction, but it's really small. It's like the sort of size of the palm of your hand. And it has hit 100,000 pre-orders. Some big device reviewers have said that they're not sure whether they love it or they hate it. So we're in that new era of hardware. People were saying the same things about Google Glass back in 2014, and that hasn't taken off. But it's certainly fun to see how these models and these platforms are then enabling hardware innovation as well. I think that is quite a fun thing. I quite like the idea of having one of these. I'll have a bit more of a think, a bit more of a dig in, and I think we'll do an episode just on this. I don't
Sounds
think
good. Yeah,
deliveries
would
of the
be keen
device
to
will.
discuss this.
Yeah, they won't get delivered to Europe until July, but I think there are a few people who have them in America at the moment.
Can we still pre-order them in Europe, or is it a US
Yeah,
thing only?
yeah, you can pre-order them. We'll pop the link in the show notes. Right, our last one, the big dog,
NVIDIA.
NVIDIA, one of
As
the
you
Magnificent
mentioned,
Seven.
it is probably unfair to bunch them along with the notable mentions just because of their market cap, right? But at the same time, their market cap and market valuation, it's not necessarily have to do with the language models that they are providing. So
No,
in that sense, maybe they are a notable mention rather than anything more than that.
that's it. So let's constrain this part to just the language model.
Correct.
And
So
they,
it's
yeah,
not
go on.
exactly the language model. So they have this product called Nemo. So it's a toolkit or framework that allows you to train machine learning models in general, not just large language models, but also potentially large language models. It is, in that sense, a bit of an alternative to, let's say, PyTorch, although they are actually using PyTorch in the backend. It is a bit also of an alternative to Hugging Face that we were discussing in a previous episode, because they offer their own model registry. So they host pre-trained models that you can download and use. That said, they only host their own models, right? So NVIDIA models rather than anything else. So it's not exactly competition, but it is an alternative delivery framework for models, let's say. I use them quite a lot in the past because they used to have very good speech text models. So these are not language models, but they are the automatic speech recognition models that take audio and then output text, right? And they used to have very good models, open models, so you could download, fine-tune them locally, run them locally, and they had very good performance. That said, that was some years ago, and I think that now Whisper models, OpenAI's Whisper models are a lot more popular than the NVIDIA Nemo models. So I'm not sure what's up anymore. They might still have very good text to speech models. These are the models that take written text and read it out loud for you, essentially. They were leaders in that space at some point. Not sure what's happening now, though.
Should I infer anything from the fact that Mistral has 5,000 models on Hugging Face and Nemo has 75? Or is it unfair to think of Nemo as something that should be on Hugging Face because does NVIDIA have its own sort of model hub and that's where most of the
So
discussion and community contributions would be?
I think that what happens with the Nemo models on Hugging Face is that they just provide a wrapper essentially, and you still need to use their own Nemo toolkit in order to download and run those models. So let's say that the Hugging Face Nemo models are just like a sort of hyperlink to like a landing page for the Nemo models that then sends you back to Nemo. So it is a bit unfair. But at the same time, I think the Mistral models are a lot more popular. And I think the number of models that you see in Hugging Face are an indication of how many people are actually taking the Mistral models as base and then further fine-tuning it and then posting it back to Hugging Face. That said, Hugging Face is a lot more popular than NVIDIA's Nemo, so it is a valid comparison. What's interesting as well is that Nemo also seems to have some kind of large language model. So except for the speech recognition and text-to-speech models, they now do seem to have some kind of large language model. But it's not easily accessible yet. It's gated behind an NDA in an early access delivery mechanism. So I don't know. I haven't heard anything about the model, so I haven't heard anyone discuss them after trying it out.
They're
They
all
do
just
seem to be,
panicking and trying to build more GPUs.
maybe. They do seem to be going after the after business as well, in a way similar to Cohere. They're saying that you can fine-tune those models using the Nemo toolkit, and that you can also have on-premise deployment for sensitive data and things like that. So I think they're going after the business market rather than consumer.
And I suppose we know the answer to this for NVIDIA, but it's interesting we haven't seen this. But the question I have now we've looked at the sort of four notable mentions to give people a bit of background. Feel free to go back. But basically, since this second season of using AI, we have gone through tools that or models that could be compared to, in some form, OpenAI's models. So we've looked at Anthropic and Claude. We've looked at Google, Gemini, and Bard, Meta, Llama, Hugging Face, which was a little bit of a curveball because they're not really a comparison. And then the notable mentions from this episode: Cohere, Mistral, Perplexity, and NVIDIA's Nemo. The fundraising in this space is mad, and it seems to come back to the idea that the more money you have, the more data and the more compute you can put into building these foundation models. And although there are some architectural innovations that mean that maybe you can still get great results from 7 billion rather than 70 billion parameters, there is this concept, isn't there, of the bitter lesson. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, Alex, and if you're able to describe that for us.
So, Peter Lesson refers to a blog post by Richard Sutton, I think, a few years ago, 2019. And it's that essentially the biggest advances in AI over the years have been due to more data and more compute rather than architectural changes in the models, which I would say is partially true, because some of those architectural changes, like transformers, for example, are what enables big compute as well. So it's not just that we have more powerful hardware or more data put into those models, it would be impossible to train at the scale that we're training without the transformer architecture. And maybe there's more architectural advancements waiting to happen that will mean that we can use our compute more efficiently and then put more data into those models and thus have better results. And it's already happening, right? So there's a ton of techniques that allow you to replicate the results of much bigger models, as you mentioned, with smaller models. And it's a never-ending battle, essentially. It might well be that the best performing models, though, will come from the companies that have more resources at their disposal, right?
Yeah, and I suppose that is a bit of a red flag for startups wanting to enter this area, because it's not a case of, okay, you do a Series A round and you can compete in any sense. Not that it is in many industries, but the size and the scale of growth, like the speed of the growth and actually the scale that these companies are at now, does mean that they have access to a larger data set and larger compute. I'm pretty sure OpenAI has like a 10 billion investment deal with NVIDIA to buy GPUs, for example. Like that's the entire value of the Microsoft partnership, which everyone thought at the time was a bananas size partnership and investment. And now it's just what they're spending on GPUs from NVIDIA over the next few years. And it feels a little bit like by brute forcing the data set size and the compute power, you get these emergent capabilities that we still don't quite know why they happen.
At the same time, if you think about a year ago, a bit more than a year now, where ChatGPT came out, a year later, we have models with the same capabilities as ChatGPT running locally on our computers, right? So is a year that much of a moat for OpenAI? Maybe they'll be a few months ahead, but if open source and self-running models catch up this quickly, then maybe it's not such a big problem. And I think that for a lot of the companies that you mentioned, first of all, there's more space in the market than just for OpenAI. And second, it might then depend on essentially your business proposition. So what segment of the market you're going after, whether you're focusing on privacy or self-running models like Cohere is, right? Self-hosted models, sorry. So even without the scale of compute and data that OpenAI has, I think smaller companies can still have a value proposition and compete with OpenAI on a specific segment of the market. And who knows, maybe in a few years, models will be good enough that small differences won't matter, right? And you'll just be running a model on your phone that's kind of as good as anything that OpenAI runs, so very close enough to that so that it's commoditized as a tool.
Yeah, there may be a point where the quality of the responses is so impressive that we are unable to discern the difference anymore. Like the difference between a 4K TV and an 8K TV, you start to not be able to see the pixels with the human eye, right? I think that's a wonderful note to wrap this episode up. And thank you very much for doing some research into those and for bringing that to us. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Cheeky request, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please can you give us a review? Go on, just hit that little 5-star button. Helps people find the show. And likewise, if you're on Spotify, please do the reviews on there. If you're on another platform, congratulations, you are relatively unique and we love you for that. So do whatever you can do on those. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. We have a couple of options for the next episode, so I won't tell you what it's going to be, but there are some interesting options. One that I'm a big fan of is looking at LLMs for other languages and how multilingual they can be. That's something that is close to my heart at the moment with my daily work when I'm using AI. So on that note, lovely chatting, Alex, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.